Lecture 4, Mesopotamian Creation, Enuma Elish.
In our last lecture, we introduced the genre of creation myths, and we set up some expectations so that we know kind of what we're looking for in the lectures ahead. We also came up with a taxonomy so that we could divide them up into categories that make it easier for us to deal with them. And then we illustrated what we were talking about with a couple of cosmogonies from Egypt. This time, I would like to summarize a really important Babylonian creation myth, one that includes this time the creation of human beings, which is a subject that the Egyptians seem not to care about that much, and then to find a place for this one in our classification scheme, and then using several different tools out of Doty's Mythographer's Toolbox, see what kind of meanings we can tease out of this. The myth itself comes from the Near East, from the place that the Greeks called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia simply means between the two rivers, and the two rivers in question here are the Tigris and Euphrates. The civilization in this part of the world was just about as old as it was in Egypt, but where Egypt's history ran in a fairly continuous channel with some interruptions, here wave after wave of invasions and conquests happened. The Sumerians were succeeded by the Akkadians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Assyrians, and finally this became part of the Persian Empire. The myth that we're looking at comes from Babylon, but some of its material is much older, reaching back to the time of the Sumerians, who provided a kind of substratum for the cultures of all of the people in this part of the world. The poem is called the Enuma Elish, and it is a Babylonian poem. It dates from about 1900 to about 1600 BCE, and it is decidedly Babylonian in its purpose. The purpose is to praise their god Marduk and to demonstrate his superiority to all other gods. It was recited at least once, and maybe more than once, every New Year's at every New Year's festival in Babylon. Like the Egyptian story that we looked at in the last lecture, this one begins with a vast expanse of waters. Here the waters, however, are personified. There is a male Apsu who represents sweet waters, and there is a female Tiamat who represents salt water. The two of them mate, and they produce two pairs of gods, one of whom produces a god named Anu, who becomes traditionally the high god of the Mesopotamian pantheon. Anu, in turn, becomes the father of Ea, the god of wisdom, and we'll come back to him because he turns out to be a really important god in all of the myths of this region. Once we've gotten to Ea, we're at the fourth generation of gods, and by this time there are enough of them around, they're rambunctious, they're noisy, and Apsu becomes annoyed with them because he can't concentrate, he can't sleep. He wants things to go back to where they were before all of these noisy gods, these offspring of his, were running around the world. So he goes to Tiamat with his vizier, and he says, I have a plan. I'm just going to wipe them all out. I'm just going to destroy them. We'll go back to things the way things were before we had all of these children. Tiamat says no. She says, we can't kill our own children. What she says, in fact, in the poem, in response to her husband's plan is, how could we allow what we ourselves created to perish? Even though their ways are so grievous, we should bear it patiently. I'm guessing that they're not the last parents in history who've said something of this sort. Apsu goes ahead with his plan anyway, but the plan gets leaked out to the rest of the gods, who are all terrified of what will happen to them. All except Ea, again, the god of wisdom, who turns out to be an extraordinarily important figure in all of these stories. He sends his great-grandfather Apsu into a deep sleep and then kills him. Then he retires to his own palace with his consort, and they produce Marduk, who is the hero of this poem. That the younger generation of God should attack and displace an older one is a motif that occurs in a lot of creation stories, including most famously perhaps that of the Greeks, where Cronus replaces Uranos and then is in turn replaced by Zeus. In all of these stories, the mother winds up siding with her children against her consort. And that's what Tiamat does initially here, too, trying to talk Apsu out of killing his own children and grandchildren. Ea once he has killed his great-grandfather, becomes himself the Lord of Sweet Waters. And that's going to be important in later myths that we look at too. He is the Lord of Sweet Waters, but he isn't a personification of Sweet Waters, as Apsu pretty much was. He's a much more anthropomorphic God, and we've seen this as one of the common patterns when you're dealing with generations of gods, is that each generation becomes a little more like humans, with a little more personality, a little more history, some interests, some physical features, and some individual stories about them. Tiamat, although she had opposed her husband's plan to begin with, is enraged when he is murdered, and she gathers together gods who hadn't sided with Ea and takes one god named Kingu as her new consort, and then produces a small army of monsters. Hearing of this impending rebellion, first Anu and then Ea try to confront Tiamat, but both of them run from her in terror when they're actually in her awful presence. That's when Marduk steps forward as a champion. He agrees to take on Tiamat, to destroy her, to defeat her, but only if he can become the new king of the gods, which the other gods are so terrified they agree to, and that's how he achieves his supremacy in the Babylonian pantheon. In the actual fight, the fight is short but violent. Marduk controls the winds, and so he fills Tiamat with air so that she gets so distended that she can't close her mouth, and then he shoots an arrow down her throat that pierces her heart, and that's the end of Tiamat. He takes back from Tiamat something called the Tablet of Fate, which had been hers, which decrees individual destinies for gods and humans, but she had given it to Kingu when he became her new consort. Then Marduk dismembers her body and uses all of the parts of her body to make the cosmos. It's an ingenious use of body parts to make the universe, to make the world. The text says he splits her in half like a dried fish, and then he makes the Tigris and Euphrates from the tears from her eyes. Her breasts become mountains, her thighs are used to prop up the heavens, and every body part is assigned some particular function. This motif of the dismembered body of a god will come across again, because that's a fairly common motif in creation stories. There is a slight twist to this one, and that is that Tiamat is sometimes pictured as a woman, sometimes as a dragon, so that she can be thought of as a monster. So in a way, you could say that Marduk is actually killing a monster when he kills her. And that she's female has seemed important to some people who believe in the great goddess hypothesis, which we'll look at in our next unit. So we will come back and revisit this myth. The fact that she's a monster and female has seemed important to a lot of people. Once Marduk has defeated her, taken her body apart, made the cosmos, then he organizes, puts things together. He puts the sun in its place, the moon, the stars, the zodiac, the constellation, and as in the Egyptian myths we looked at last time, this is the beginning of time. Then he creates humans. Humans are created so that the gods won't have to do work that they consider tedious. They have to do all of the irrigation, all of the planting, all of the harvesting, and they get bored with this, tired of it, worn out by it. And so humans are actually invented in this myth, created in this myth, so that they can do the hard work that the gods don't want to have to do themselves. Marduk, the way human beings get invented or created, I keep saying invented, the way they get created in this poem is that Marduk takes Kingu, who was the consort of Tiamat, and he kills him, and then uses the blood of Kingu to make human beings from. This has seemed important to some people. It's an interesting detail anyway, that we should have been made out of the blood of a rebel against the gods. In some cases, some people have speculated that this maybe accounts for why we have to die, that we are made, after all, from a rebel, the blood of a rebel who had to be killed in order to create us. Other people have suggested a tiniest hint here of some kind of congenital flaw that gets passed down from generation to generation. The idea that somehow we start out with rebel blood in our veins has made us in some ways rebellious ourselves, or at least potentially rebellious, something that we carry on from one generation to the next. Anyway, whatever else we think about this story, we do know that humans were created for servitude and for death. That's very clear in this story. And the afterlife, as far as the Babylonians are concerned, was a really terrible place. There was no afterlife to look forward to. It's pretty awful, as it's described, as we'll come across it in Lecture 22 when we're talking about Gilgamesh. It's a bodiless, shadowy kind of existence in which one lives like a bat and eats dirt. Every man and woman, that is, and this is a really ambiguous kind of legacy that we get from our creation stories, every man and woman has a destiny from the Tablet of Fate. This is that one that Marduk takes from Kingu. So that as long as our destiny is written in this Tablet of Fate, we have some part to play in a divine plan. We're important. But it also is true that when we wear out, we get thrown onto the dustbin, and there is no exit from that. That life after death is nothing to look forward to. What it suggests, among other things, is that for the Babylonians, life was always hard work, and it always has an unhappy ending. David McYagan, in a book called Creation Myths, says that the word that is used for each body part of Tiamat that's taken to make the cosmos, that word is called kubu. And the kubu is each individual body part that goes into making the cosmos. But he says it's interesting that that same word kubu is used for a fetus in the womb and for metallic ore in the ground. And he says the point here is that every single thing that humans achieve is going to be won with hard work and pain. As the cosmos is created out of the body of a murdered goddess, so childbearing or digging up metals from the ground will all be hard work. And there's a suggestion in this story that there are no free gifts for human beings, even if we are written in the Tablet of Fate. If we use our classification system that we introduced last time, we can see that this is pretty much a separation of world parents myth. Apsu and Tiamat want things to stay the way they were in a kind of stasis, a kind of passivity, a kind of inertness. Their children upset this, they upset this unchanging reality by wanting to do things, by making noise, by upsetting their parents. And so what the children cause their parents to separate. The myths of this sort usually tell us that the children want light. They're seeking for light, and that's why they separate their parents. This myth doesn't quite say that, but the fact that Marduk should immediately create the sun immediately after he kills Tiamat suggests that this may be a motive in this story too. Anyway, it's always the children who cause the separation, and it's what initiates change and time and everything implied by life lived away from the parents and that initial inertia. The new source of life after the separation is the sun, which in many myths becomes what mythographers call a fecundator, the male agent of creation. The female earth, with a new consort, continues to be fertile and to procreate, especially since, as in this myth, the whole cosmos is actually created out of her body. She's still there. She's still productive. She's still fertile. This occurs, there are parallels in a lot of other myths to suggest how the sun becomes this agent of procreation once the sky moves far away. There's a Hopi Indian myth in which men and women couldn't get along and they were put on opposite sides of a river. And one day, one of the young women exposes her vulva to the sun, and sun's rays engender in her two twins, which continue the process of creation. We can see how the sun immediately picks up this sort of fecundator or fertilizing role. So even when the genders are separated and Father Sky is either pushed far away or castrated as he is in Greek stories or killed as he is in this one, the sun becomes the fertilizing agent so that life can go on. These myths always start with masculine and feminine in such harmony that nothing can ever happen. The opening lines of the Enuma Elish here are very good about describing the stasis at the very beginning of things. When the skies above were not yet named, nor earth below pronounced by name, Apsu, the first one, their begetter, and maker Tiamat, who bore them all, had mixed their waters together, but had not formed pastures, nor discovered reed beds, when yet no gods were manifest, nor names pronounced, nor destinies decreed. So that, once again, as in so many other myths that we've already mentioned and will mention in the future, a differentiated sexuality dividing male and female in some ways is a sign of the one becoming the many, of wholeness giving up to plenitude. There's a really wonderful parallel version of this story, this idea that splitting up the genders is what leads to creation and leads to the energy of creation in Plato's Symposium. In Plato's Symposium, he has Aristophanes tell a story. They're trying to define what love is. And what Aristophanes says is that originally when we were created as androgynous creatures. We had 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 heads, and so that male and female were sort of united into a single creature. In Aristophanes' version of the story in Plato, we got uppity and Zeus punished us by splitting us in half. So each one of us now is a half creature. Half, the male and the female are separated off from one another. And what Aristophanes says is that's what love is. Love is the way we spend all the rest of our lives looking for our other halves, trying to put ourselves in some ways back together again. Here, the entire process, as happens so frequently in creation myths, begins with water. Tiamat is salt water, Apsu is fresh water, and both are killed so that the world can be created and humans set on it. Water is almost always the sort of formless chaos out of which everything emerges, and it's always still there as a place to which everything can return, overwhelm everything and return Earth to that primal chaos from which everything began, which is perhaps one of the reasons why flood stories are so prevalent. The water is the womb out of which everything comes. It also can be the grave into which the cosmos can sink back into its kind of sleepy stasis. The new element for us in this myth is the dismemberment of the goddess and then creating the universe out of her body. This is a different category of creation myths, one that we'll encounter several more times in the course, and in fact we will take this one up in a lecture or two just down the road. Bruce Lincoln, in a book called Myth, Cosmos, and Society, the subtitle is Indo-European Themes of Creation and Destruction, devotes an entire book to just this theme. The focus in his book is on Indo-European versions, and neither Egyptian nor Babylonian belong in that language category, but his findings can be more generally applied. In myths like this, the parts of the dismembered God which become the cosmos, he calls aloe forms. Aloe forms are simply alternative shapes of one another, so that when a dismembered God's eye becomes the sun or his flesh becomes the earth, these are the same substance in alternate forms. And in the myths, these two forms are always alternating with one another in a continuous process, so that the one is always being changed into the other. In this kind of myth, the body of the primeval creature becomes the material from which the cosmos is created. And then the physical cosmos provides the materials for the creation of human beings. In many stories, humans are made typically from clay, which came from the body of the dismembered primal being in the first place. So the first part of this story is always one of dismemberment. The second part is a kind of reconstruction story, putting the elements back together to make the human body. The same materials are used in both, but the process passes it back and forth between the microcosm, that is the individual human body, and the macrocosm, which is the cosmos. So whenever the individual created body is destroyed, the cosmos is created, and whenever the body is created, the cosmos is destroyed. History is the passing back and forth between these two poles. You can see this, one of Lincoln's examples, the example of breathing. Every time I breathe out, I exhale, I take breath and it becomes wind. Every time I inhale, wind becomes breath. And as we said, wind and breath are so often in early languages the same word that we understand how that reciprocal relationship works. We still have some leftovers of this in our own language. We have, so that we use wind and breath kind of interchangeably with one another. We say that not a breath was stirring. We say we can get our second wind, we can get winded, we can break a horse's wind, which suggests that even our language carries the memories of a time when breath and wind were considered to be alloforms of one another and could change back and forth from one to the other. This is a kind of ultimate wisdom of this kind of creation myth, that the universe becomes the material stuff out of which you and I are created, And when we die, we revert back to original stuff. Matter is eternal in this kind of myth. Nothing is ever lost, but it's constantly being transmuted back and forth from one to the other. The idea of sacrifice, sacrifice, what a sacrifice does is it takes apart a creature, dismembers it, and then sends it into the cosmos, which means that every sacrifice in a very visual and precise way is a recreation of the original creation. That is the dismemberment of Tiamat. As Tiamat was taken apart to make the cosmos, every sacrifice takes some sacrificial victim apart and sends it off into the cosmos. That means that our own deaths, in a way, become a kind of sacrifice. At the end of our lives, we translate our own bodily matter back into cosmic form. Our breath once more becomes the wind, our bodies become the earth. And the death of each of us is a guarantee that the cosmos will persist. That is, we give ourselves back to the cosmos as a gift at our own death. In cultures that have a theory of a life after death, there's going to be one more step in this process when at the very end of time, when the earth is finally destroyed, the earth will be taken apart for the last time to recreate our bodies. So that there is some really profound wisdom in this whole idea of the dismembered God, and we will have a chance to explore this in a little more detail in some lectures ahead. What I want to do to finish up this myth, however, is to take a look at it from a couple of different points of view, a couple of different angles of vision that'll allow us a couple different tools from Doty's Mythographer's Toolkit to see what else we can tell about it, what we can find out about it. I want to begin with a book by Theodor Gaster called Thespis, Ritual, Myth, and Drama in the Ancient Near East. Gaster argues for a very precise connection between ritual and myth. According to Gaster, myth is simply an explanation for ritual. Ritual is simply the enactment of myth. This at one time in the 19th century was a very, very important way of dealing with myth. And Gaster thinks it's still important enough if we understand that it's only one tool in the Mythographer's Toolkit. It isn't the entire toolkit itself. For Gaster, it's really important to remember that this myth, the myth of the Enuma Elish, was always read and maybe even enacted at the New Year's festival in Babylon. He understands this myth. He says what the myth is, it's a vegetative myth. It's one of those myths that was performed regularly by agricultural people as a way of guaranteeing the fertility of the soil, of getting a lease on agriculture for another year. And usually these things were celebrated at the solstices or at the equinoxes, and the point was to renew the annual lease on life, to guarantee crops for the coming year. The king, according to this myth, would be either literally killed. Sir James Fraser in his Golden Bough has a lot of examples of this. The king would actually be literally killed, or he would be ritually killed. That is, stripped of all of his regalia, sent through a kind of penance and then a reinvigoration process, and then reintroduced, restored as a virile young king. We'll get more of this and more detail about this in our unit on gods and goddesses. The event, according to Gaster, is always preceded by a period of fasting. The temple is ceremonially purged. A scapegoat figure is beaten and driven out to bear away the sins of the community. And then there's a ritual combat between Marduk and Tiamat, and then the king is reinvested and he takes part in a sacred marriage. The king stands in for Marduk, a priestess stands in for his consort, and their mating assures fertility for another year. The Enuma Elish, as we said, was read at least once and perhaps several times, creating, as Eliade would say, an axis mundi. This is one of those places where reciting that creation myth invokes the powers of creation and brings them to bear on the need for agricultural fertility for the coming year. Then, at the very end of the festival, there was going to be a great feast to which the gods were invited and to which they were assumed to attend, even though people couldn't really see them when they were in attendance. This festival, with all of its elements, all of the things that go together, including the story of the overthrow of Marduk, or of Tiamat by Marduk, his assumption of sovereignty, his establishment of cosmic order, the creation of human beings, the celebration of a new order for a new year, and each year the reestablishment of a vigorous young king who would lead them. All of these things bring us back and reconnect us with the powers of creation, and thus guarantee, insofar as it's possible for us to guarantee, success and fertility for a coming year. There's a very different kind of reading. If we take out our psychological kit or tool from our toolkit, there's a very different reading that was done by a woman named Marie-Louise von Franz in a book called Patterns of Creativity Mirrored in Creation Myths. She very definitely is using Doty's psychological tool from his toolbox. Von Franz was a student of Carl Jung, and so for her, myths are really not about supernatural beings. They're not necessarily even about the cosmos out there. Rather, with Jung, she sees all myths as in some ways related to the inner cosmos, that is, the inner parts of ourselves. She sees this myth in particular as a story about the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, as it's understood by Jung. So for her, the figures, the events, all of these things that occur in a myth are not necessarily about things out there, they are rather about things in here. Here, she says, in this story, what we have is we have a mother goddess who is killed and the cosmos is created out of her corpse. What von Franz says is, in Jungian terms, Tiamat represents something like the unconscious, that kind of infantile, instinctual bag of impulses that we all start out with. She has to be destroyed, von Franz said, so that adult consciousness can develop. As infants, we're full of conflicting impulses, which von Franz sees as represented or reflected in the many myths about gods who fight against each other. As we grow up, we have to develop an ego consciousness or a conscious ego to serve as a kind of central impulse for all of these impulses. And then that central office can make decisions about which impulses to observe, which to honor, and which to suppress. But in the process of creating this central consciousness, this conscious ego, this central office for ourselves, in that process, what gets destroyed are our instinctual impulses. It's why for her, Tiamat has to be a primitive creature, a monster, a dragon, suggesting the primitive nature of all of these instincts that have to be destroyed. To illustrate her point, she tells a Chinese myth from the Zhuangzi, the Taoist book. And the myth is about the master of the southern seas and the master of the northern seas, who always meet at a neutral place called Huan Tun, which is sometimes translated as chaos, but which she translates as the unconscious, because she's reading this as a story of the inner journey, not an outer one. Huan Tun has no senses. He has no ears, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, but he's a good friend to these two masters, and they decide to reward him for his friendship by drilling 7 holes in his body to give him access to the world outside. They drill 1 new hole each day, but when they start drilling the 7th one, he dies. And von Franz says, insofar as he represents the unconscious, he can't survive into consciousness. That is, you can't create something new without killing something old. Here, coming to consciousness has to kill the old, preconscious, instinctual, infantile self. Coming to consciousness is, of course, in many ways, a great advance over the kind of unified instinctual life that we may have led as infants or in prenatal existence. But it can't be created without killing Huan Tun. That preconscious life is perhaps something like what we lived in the womb. In the myth we've been considering, it's symbolized by that eternal union of sky and earth. When nothing happens, nothing changes. For Jung, and for von Franz here in her reading of this myth, what's lost, what gets destroyed in Huan Tun doesn't disappear, it's simply repressed into the unconscious. As in this myth, the world that we live on is still the body of Tiamat. For Jungians, the point of the whole second half of life is to make contact with those buried parts of ourselves, to reconnect with them, to get back in touch with them. In a way, This is the kind of reading, the psychological reading, is the kind of reading that we did with our alligators in the sewer urban myth in our very first lecture, in which we read the sewers, or said that sewers could be read not as literal sewers, but as the maze of the unconscious that we have inside ourselves. We'll get to do a lot more Jungian readings and to read more, understand the ways in which for Jungians, myths are always about the unconscious and the conscious life, the inner life rather than the outer life, especially in our unit on heroes. And we will come back to the Enuma Elish later in the course in our second unit on gods and goddesses. In our next lecture, we will change over to what is, for us anyway, in our world, is probably the most famous creation myth of all. That is the myth from Genesis about Adam and Eve. We will add it to our list of creation myths that we have, again, do some comparison and contrast, and see what kind of meanings we can tease out of it. That's next time.